Prodigal Son is the 14th episode of the 4th season of Everybody Loves Raymond. This is directed by Will Mackenzie, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. I really enjoyed the episode, but I do think that if you're not religious, you might not like it. Or if you're completely against religion of any kind, you might not like it. It's not necessarily because it's very much in favour of religion, but it does seem one-sided with the argument that people should go to church if their families do, if it's tradition. Ray has arguments against that, but they're not evenly weighted. I will go through some points that Ray raises for why he doesn't go to church, but I think that's just worth bearing in mind that it definitely, in my opinion, seems like it's in favour of going to church for some people, and I personally enjoy that aspect, but I know not everybody will. But as I said, I thought it was a good episode. It starts off with everybody getting ready for church, and Marie and Frank and Robert come over, and Ali has asked Debra why Ray doesn't go to church. Everybody else does, but Ray never does. And he says it's because he is working, even though the game doesn't start till 1 o'clock. And he points out there's a pre-game, and on the one hand, yes, that's fair enough, but on the other, it's very clear that this is absolutely an excuse. And in the next scene, Ali shows Ray a picture that she's drawn, and we find out that it's a picture of Ray in hell. And this is because Grandpa said he'll go to hell. And we'll come back to the wording of that in a second. But Ray, of course, is really annoyed that Frank would dare tell Ali that he would go to hell because he doesn't go to church. I think that's quite a bold claim to make. And we do have this delightful scene. Just before Ray goes over there, we see Frank in the kitchen, and there's this chocolate cake on the table, and he's very excited, and he calls through to Marie, and Marie gives him permission to eat the cake, and it's adorable. It's a lovely scene. And then Ray comes over and questions Frank and ruins the atmosphere. And we do find out that Frank never actually said Ray was going to hell specifically. Ali had asked him what happens to people who don't go to church, and Frank had said they go to hell. And I think there's a good message there that you need to be careful with what you say to children, because a child could very easily start to panic that their parent is going to hell because they don't go to church. And I think a young child, it's important to maybe be a little bit more mindful. Ali doesn't actually seem that concerned, to be honest, but Ray is still upset that Frank would even put this idea in Ali's head, and they get into an argument, and Frank is shouting at him, and Marie is upset as well. But Frank is really, really annoyed at Ray for not going to church. And honestly, I didn't really know why exactly Frank was that annoyed, but we have an interesting theory from Debra, which we'll get to in a second. Ray is then at home with Debra. He's eaten an entire tub of ice cream, and just as he's about to go upstairs, Debra asks him, why don't you go to church? And she gives Ray the chance to actually explain things, which I think was really nice. I really appreciated that. She wasn't just irritated that Ray couldn't be bothered to go to church or whatever it was. He gave Ray the chance to explain himself, which I think was really important and very well handled. And they have a pretty good discussion. And he explains that when he's there, his mind is not on the Lord. His mind is not on the church. His mind is on the game or his work or anything else, and he's just going through the motions. And Debra kind of agrees that if he's just going through the motions, what's the point in being there? And I think that also is an interesting point. Some people will argue against that. Some people will say that even when you don't want to be there, it's important to show up because that's what you do. But at the same time, if you're not there for the right reasons, is there any point in you being there? And I think that there are valid arguments either side. And he says as well, and I also like this argument, that he doesn't need to go to church to prove his goodness. And now some would argue that's not why you go to church. But there are definitely people who go to church because it makes them feel superior, because they're doing this thing that's, even though it's a routine and it's maybe not the most exciting thing to do, they do it because it's the right thing to do, and that makes them a better person. So again, I think it does show pros and cons in that way, but I feel like after this discussion, and I'll talk, of course, about what happens, after this discussion, I feel like it's not quite as balanced, and I feel like it remains in favour of going to church for whatever reason. And we'll obviously explain the reasons for Ray in a moment. And Debra gives her reason, which I really liked. Debra said she goes because it shows that she's part of something bigger and the world is not just about her and her little problems with her phrasing. And I think that that's a really great reason to go, to be reminded that there's more to life than just your own little bubble. And I think that that's really great. And she also suggests, and this is the thing that I didn't pick up on, but when Debra said this, I kind of thought that makes sense. She suggests to Ray that Frank is annoyed because his faith was the only thing of value that he had to pass on to Ray. They're Catholics. The boys were obviously raised as Catholic, and Frank doesn't have this huge legacy. He hasn't got a load of money. He's not passing on his career insights to Ray because Ray obviously has a very different career journey. So his faith is really the only thing of value that he might think he has on to pass on to Ray. And I thought that was a really interesting point as well. And this clearly had an effect on Ray because the next thing we see is Ray at the church. And Frank initially is suspicious about why he's there, but he explains that he wants to set an example for his kids the way Frank did for him and Robert, which I think is as good a reason as any. And we then find out, well, first of all, Robert says, and I love this quote as well, Robert said, "No one applauds the faithful son because the faithful son never leaves," which is very true. Ray is getting praise from Frank for finally doing the right thing. Robert never gets praise for doing the right thing, even though he does it again and again and again. And I think that that's very true. If you do the right thing constantly, nobody cares. And I'm not saying they should care, but when you do the right thing for the first time, people make a big deal out of it. But again, I think they should, because it helps to reinforce the fact that you're doing the right thing. But Robert clearly wouldn't have felt great in that moment. And we then find out that actually Frank is an usher, and he doesn't have to spend the entire service listening to the talk, having to just sit there hoping that something interesting is being said so his mind doesn't wander. Frank gets to do other things and spend time with his friends and collect money and then sort it out. And honestly, I can see that being appealing for Frank. And as Frank explained, he gets to keep Marie happy by being there, or at least Marie can't complain at him because he's there, but he gets the best of both worlds as well because he actually gets to have a decent time with his friends. And apparently there's a very long waiting list for people who want to become ushers, which was Ray's initial suggestion. Maybe he could do that with Frank as well, and it could be a bonding thing. But no, there's a long waiting list. Ray has no choice but to go and listen to the talk and listen to what's being said. And then we see Ray, well, causing problems. His mind is wandering and he's being a bit of a bother. And we end on it gets a bit of an interesting note. And I enjoyed the episode because I think it spoke to me a lot personally. I think it raised a lot of really valid points. But as I said, I don't think it's completely balanced. Maybe it's just my reading of the episode, but I personally feel like the episode is saying you should find a reason to go to church. Whether it's to make your parents happy, or to set an example, or so your children won't think you're going to burn in hell, or because it's a way to show that there's more to life than your own little bubble. Which are all, I guess, valid reasons. But I do think that anybody who's maybe against going to church or who just could not care less, which is absolutely fine, I feel like that the episode might seem a little bit preachy. Obviously, I can't fully claim that that's the case because I am in favour of religion, so I don't know for certain. I'd love to know if you watch this episode as somebody who's either an atheist or agnostic. Do you think it feels preachy? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's absolutely fine. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But if somebody were to say, I don't like it, I feel like I was being told to go to church when it's not for me, I could understand that argument. But from my perspective, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the discussions. I thought it was a very well written episode. Not necessarily the funniest. In terms of funny moments, I'll be honest, there are not that many. I think Frank enjoying his cake was, I guess, not funny, but very sweet, really lovely. But other than that, there are a few small things here and there, but in general, I wouldn't say it's the funniest episode. But I'd say it's maybe one of the most thought-provoking. I thought it was a very well-written episode. I can understand if somebody were to say it didn't really work for them. But personally, for me, I thought Prodigal Son was certainly an enjoyable episode of Everybody Loves Raymond.